actually brought plugs.
Yeah, look at that.
I know.
I recognize those.
By the way, you guys need to update this.
Because of 2015, yeah. We still don't have 2016 services trade data.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics and to the second in a series of discussions on U.S. Mexico relations. My name's Christina Luhn, and I'm the summer fellow. And it's a great privilege and a lot of fun for me to be doing this year. I recognize a few faces from last week, but I understand and I see a number of you are new today, and I appreciate everybody who's come out. Thank goodness it quit raining. So I'll give a very quick background on why I'm doing this again, why I wanted to do this, and why it's important, and who our guest discussant is today. And when I proposed this to Bill, gosh, a year ago, doing something on U.S. Mexico relations, one of my goals was to kind of fill the gap between people who work at the border, which I did for almost 8 years, and people who live away from the border but have very many concerns and interest about what's going on and what's going on in Mexico and what's going on along the border and what does it mean to us sitting here in Kansas. So when I proposed this, the goal was to bring experts in so folks sitting here in the middle of the United States could have access to these experts, and these experts could hear from people from Kansas and hear what questions they have, what are their fears, what are their concerns, and so just to have this dialogue. And so I was very pleased when Bill came back to me and said, hey, would you be interested in doing it this summer? And I said, sure. So here we are. So today we're going to talk a little bit more about U.S. Mexico relations and trade and NAFTA. And the expert I have here with us today is Christopher Wilson. And Chris works at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. And we've known each other a couple of years. We worked kind of on issues together, kind of at a distance. In fact, I showed him, I have a couple of studies that he has helped produce. If you've not ever been to the Wilson Center in D.C. or you haven't been to their website, I suggest you do it. They have more information than you'd ever want to know about U.S. Mexico and about other kinds of important Russia. There's a Russia Center, there's a Latin American Center, there's a variety of things that the Wilson Center does. So enough about me. one of the reasons I did want to bring Chris in was because trade, as you all know, is very important. And with the political rhetoric going on right now, it's become an even larger issue. And so one of the things I wanted to do was kind of sort through some of the reality from the myth, as well as kind of take a little deeper dive into just what has changed in Mexico and how our relations have changed with Mexico as well. And talk a little bit about trade in general and the value and the challenges of having multinational trade agreements, which sounds very kind of dry, but actually it's very important because, for example, in Kansas, Mexico has just become Kansas' primary trade, export market. And so if there's a negative change in NAFTA, it could impact the entire economy of the state. And as we all know, it's already being challenged somewhat. So this is a very timely and important issue, and Chris is going to help break down some of the complexity for us. So first, everybody say hello to Chris Wilson.
Good afternoon.
And could you tell us just a little bit about yourself?
Sure.
Like
Thanks so
where
much,
you
Christina.
from and how you got involved in
Yeah.
Mexico and everything. So a little bit about yourself.
Of course. Yeah, first, thanks very much, Christina, for the invitation to be out here. Thanks to the Dole Institute for having me out, and for all of you for coming out today. Yeah, I am actually from, not too far away in St. Louis, Missouri. Grew up there, and then I went to college in Colorado, at the University of Colorado. And I started working in education as a student, and then afterwards for a number of years, mostly with students who were learning English as a second language. And in Colorado, that meant that 90-some% of my students were from Mexico, which sparked my interest in Mexico and led me to do some study abroad programs, like short-term study abroad programs in Mexico, and ultimately to end up working in education, working with a study abroad program in Mexico, helping take American students to spend semesters in Mexico. And from there, decided I wanted to move from sort of the education space into policy. And so that took me to Washington, D.C. to study the U.S. Mexico relationship and get involved, begin my professional career, where I've really focused very intently on that issue.
Well, good. So how much time did you spend in Mexico?
A couple of years. In Cuernavaca first, and then I also worked later in Mexico City as a trade consultant.
Oh, very interesting. So how did you end up at the Wilson Center?
Yeah, there's really, so when I moved to Washington and was interested in working on U.S. Mexico policy issues, there's really only a handful of places that do that type of work, and the Wilson Center is the only place that has sort of a dedicated shop to work on U.S. Mexico relations, a dedicated program and staff to work on U.S. Mexico relations. So it was, in some ways, sort of a no-brainer for me, somebody who was really interested in working on policy, but not necessarily working on policy issues from within government. I was always really interested in the idea of having that sort of the freedom that you get from being outside of government and the ability to pursue ideas, to pursue a line of investigation and research. And so the Wilson Center ended up being a perfect fit. So from the beginning, I started to develop a relationship with them and work on certain projects. And then after doing a few other things, working in the military as an analyst on Mexico issues, for example, I came back to the Wilson Center when a position opened up.
Oh, great. Didn't know all of this, so I'm learning this too. Now, I actually was a graduate student intern at the Wilson Center a million years ago when it was in the actual castle, the old Smithsonian castle, and it's now in a great new facility. And you've been there how long?
In the new building?
Yeah.
For 12 years, maybe a little bit longer than that now even. The building, it was the Reagan building, and it was built, at the end of the 1990s, and we shortly thereafter moved in to the new building.
So can you just briefly explain what the
Yeah.
Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, or the Wilson Center, is?
Yeah, of course. So the interesting thing here is that President Woodrow Wilson is still to date the only U.S. president to ever have had a PhD. And so he worked, he was I want to say the word in Spanish, I don't know why, rector. He was the head of Princeton University before he went into government and became the governor of New Jersey and then became the president of the United States. And so he in his life worked between the worlds of academia and the world of public policy. And so in his memory, instead of getting a Lincoln Memorial or a Washington Monument, he got the Woodrow Wilson Center. A place that in his memory works, at the intersection of the worlds of public policy and academia, and sort of bringing together research and applied public policy. And so we mostly work on foreign affairs issues. That's where his legacy was really the strongest in terms of his vision for creating the League of Nations and things like that. Not to head too deeply into his legacy. So we now have programs covering U.S. relations with most of the world, with regional programs like you had mentioned, and then a few sort of more cross-cutting programs on issues of environmental security, the sort of nexus between environment and security issues, a program on science and technology, things like that.
And so when I was there, again, a million years ago, one of the things that was known for was the Wilson Quarterly, which is an academic journal that mostly the fellows, the resident and non-resident fellows would publish in. Now, there were no websites or the internet or anything back then, so it's really changed a great deal. And so you all publish. I mean, there's blogs, there's all kinds of ongoing things. Do you still have a lot of fellows, resident and non-resident fellows?
Yeah, that's one of the things that distinguishes the Wilson Center from some of the other think tanks around town, has been our ability to not just have our in-house staff, people like me, working on issues and finding ways to bring those to policymakers, bring our research to policymakers, but to also have the sort of constant stream of academics, but also practitioners, whether journalists, former officials from around the world, not just from the United States, come in and spend a period of 3, 6 to 9 months at the Wilson Center working on some sort of research project or some sort of public policy relevant project. And so it makes it an amazing place to work because we have this sort of steady stream of brilliant people from around the world coming in, teaching us about what's going on all around the world and on really important policy issues.
Well, great. So, well, thank you for your kind of overview of the Wilson Center. I'm so glad that not only is it going strong, but it's continuing to evolve. I mean, when I was there, the Latin American program had not been going that long from what I'm trying to remember the history of it, but the Mexico Center didn't exist.
Right. Yeah,
So,
we've only been around for, I guess, next year we'll celebrate 15 years.
Oh, wow,
Yeah.
that's great. And because I did work on the border and I'm so interested in it, you've taken a more border or added to your portfolio, really kind of focusing on the border. I just want to make a plug for that. So can you explain quickly about how that's been added to your portfolio and kind of what you're doing along some of the border issues?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, we at the Mexico Institute have sort of identified 5 issue areas that we try to maintain sort of steady focus on, and those are U.S. Mexico economic relations and competitiveness and regional competitiveness in general, security and rule of law, migration, energy, and the border. And with the border, I mean, one of the things, in some ways it's a combination of all those other issues, right? I mean, so you'd think, why do we need to have a special sort of area of focus on it? But because, it's a lot of these big issues that are important issues for the United States, for Mexico, they come together in a really focused, intense way in terms of the border itself and have a very big impact on border communities themselves. And one of the things that we felt like was that the conversation nationally about the border, which has been a really important one, border policy, immigration policy, drug policy, trade policy, that we didn't necessarily have the voices of people who are living those things on a day-to-day basis represented adequately in conversations in Washington about the border. And so one of the big things we try to do in our work on the border has been trying to bring more voices from border communities to be present in Washington and be a part of those debates. And then the other sort of big picture thing that I think we've tried to do is we try to instead of seeing border issues one at a time through a single lens, which is the way we tend to see them from Washington, right? It's all about migration and border security to stop illicit migration one day. Then it's about drug trafficking the next day, or if it's after 9/11, it's all about preventing terrorist attacks. And those are all important policy goals. But it's, the thing about putting these policies together is that there can have unintended consequences from one to the other, right? So if you increase border security, that can have economic consequences. If you change the economic development model for the border region that can have environmental consequences. All these things end up actually overlapping and having sort of impacts on each other. And so we felt that it was important to try to also promote a more comprehensive, holistic conversation about border policy so that we would take into account some of the ways that there are spillovers between issue areas.
Well, good. All right, so now to trade and NAFTA and deeper dive into U.S. Mexico relations. You'll notice, for those that you were here last week, you know that Bill made me promise not to do any PowerPoints, and I said, no problem. But each time I'm picking a photo or a slide that's kind of representative of the day, because sometimes a visualization really helps kind of set the framework for the discussion. And so you can see it today, the Kansas-Mexico trade relationship. It's obviously quite important. I mean, we think of ag, obviously, because Kansas is such an agricultural state, and you just have to drive 10 minutes from here and you can see evidence of it. There are other things besides agriculture, too. I mean, we don't think about it, but Kansas actually is an exporter of aerospace products. So anything, again, that changes with NAFTA could have a negative or positive impact, but right now, since it's the great unknown, we don't know what's going to happen. And so we hear a lot about, gee, trade's good, trade's bad. Globalization is good, globalization is bad. So I thought that Chris would be the perfect person to kind of help walk us through a little bit about the value of NAFTA. What is NAFTA? I mean, many of you have heard of it, and probably most of you know what NAFTA is, but if you could just kind of give us a quick overview of what is NAFTA and why it's so important.
Okay, sure. Yeah, I mean, NAFTA is the North American Free Trade Agreement, which is between Canada, Mexico, and the United States. The United States already had a free trade agreement with Canada in the 1980s. It was finished. So when they, sorry, my phone's buzzing in my pocket here, let me just turn it off. So when there was a conversation as to whether or not Mexico would join NAFTA, would join the trade agreement between the two countries. And so at a certain point, Mexico decided that it wanted to. And the reasons for Mexico, the big reasons were sort of twofold, that they wanted to join in a free trade agreement with the United States in particular, but also with Canada. On the one hand, the goal was to attract foreign investment into Mexico, greater foreign investment to sort of propel its development path forward. And then the other one was actually an interesting thing that you see a lot of countries do with trade agreements, which is the goal was to lock in reforms that were being made domestically. So Mexico in the 1980s went through a huge economic transition from being a closed import substitution economy where they had big walls to block off trade from other nations. The goal was to try to foment the growth of domestic industries, which actually worked for a time. But it essentially stopped working. Companies stopped growing because they weren't facing competition to spur them to innovate and grow and become more competitive. And so eventually Mexico decided to change that model and to open up and privatize certain industries, but also just to open up to the world and engage in the global economy. That was a very contentious thing to do in Mexico. And so by locking in some of those reforms, NAFTA was a way to lock in those reforms because they made a commitment at the treaty level with the United States to be an open economy, essentially. And so what NAFTA is a trade and investment agreement. It opens up trade, it lowers trade barriers, particularly tariff barriers between the countries to basically zero on all products, and that it includes investor protections. So, protections for foreign investments that are made to ensure that they're not expropriated, that they're not treated in a way that's less, advantageous than what they treat their domestic market. In that sense, NAFTA was very successful. If you just sort of think of it narrowly as the goals being to promote trade and investment, it was hugely successful because both trade and investment between the United States and Mexico are up sixfold from what they were pre-NAFTA times. So if that's your sort of metric of success, it's very, very successful. But NAFTA was promised, I think, in sort of because NAFTA had to be passed by the Congresses of all three countries, it was promised to be maybe a lot more than that. It was promised to be in Mexico sort of a free ticket to the first world and developed country status. It was promised in the United States to be a solution to the problem of unauthorized migration from Mexico to the United States. It was sold as something much bigger than a narrow trade investment agreement. And in terms of sort of a solution to Mexico's development challenges, I think we can say, maybe it didn't live up to that kind of potential. And so it depends on what yardstick you choose to use to measure it as to whether or not you'll decide if it's been successful or not. But it's very sort of basic level. It's a trade and investment agreement between the three countries of North America.
So just out of curiosity, how has this trading bloc then, the NAFTA trading bloc, Canada, U.S., Mexico, how has that stood up to the rest of the world? I mean, has it, instead of looking at the granular level, and we know there are winners or losers, but has that benefited all three countries in terms of interacting on a trade level with the rest of the world?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is one of the things that was probably not fully understood that would happen when NAFTA was put into place, was to the extent to which we would really end up creating a continental system of production. And so that's what we have today. I mean, there's no such thing as a Mexican car, there's no such thing as an American car, there's no such thing as a Canadian car. All of the cars built in North America are made of parts and materials from throughout North America. And so what I'm trying to say there is that instead of just having a simple model where countries create things themselves and then trade them between one another, among one another, at this point we really build products together in North America. And so the reason that we do that, the reason that companies or supply chains get spread out across a region is in order to become more competitive, right? The reason that you move part of your production to Mexico is because it's a labor-intensive part of production. You can do that for a little better price in Mexico. Capital-intensive production or production that requires high levels of human capital, you can probably do for a little bit better value in the United States or in Canada. And so by spreading, and you just get economies of scale by spreading, growing production to fit an entire regional market. And this is what we see other regions of the world doing as well, right? I mean, this is an important thing to keep in mind is that, the reason that Germany is such a successful manufacturing powerhouse is because they work together with the countries of Eastern Europe to do some of the more labor-intensive parts of production. The reason that Japan and South Korea are so successful in being manufacturing powerhouses is because they work with the nations of Southeast Asia and East Asia to be a part of that joint manufacturing platform. And you can only do those things within a region. You can't do that type of really intensive back and forth production across oceans. It's just, globalization exists at a certain level, but really in terms of manufacturing supply chains, regional supply chains are what we've seen kind of come to predominate. And in that sense, U.S., Mexican, and Canadian competitiveness have become very linked together. Because if you're building products together, you depend on the other economy to be competitive and successful just as you try to be yourself. And so, yeah, I mean, in terms of how we've been successful in that, it depends on how you measure it. I mean, there are lots of people who have come up with different measures. Some would say we're the most competitive region in the world. If you just look at World Economic Forum competitiveness rankings, North America does great. We end up on top. We do better than Europe, we do better than East Asia, we do better than anyone. If you look at other measures of sort of the depth of integration, maybe we're a little bit less integrated than the European Union, for example, because we haven't taken, we don't have full labor mobility. We still have borders between our countries. That's not our model. That's not what we're trying to accomplish. And so it depends on what sort of how you measure it. But yes, I mean, I'd say at a very basic level, we've been successful at, maintaining the competitiveness of the region by growing our interactions and our sort of cross-border supply chains.
So those are a lot of the pluses when we certainly hear not only the political rhetoric, but anybody can turn on the news and see in-depth stories of communities that have really been hit hard by not just NAFTA, but by globalization and this big term of globalization. So how has NAFTA played into that negative piece of globalization? And just kind of to remind everybody, what do we mean by globalization?
Sure. I mean, I think at the most basic level, when we're talking about globalization, we're talking about that stretching of supply chains to become international, right? To become either regional or to become global in nature. We're talking about offshoring certain aspects of production. We're talking about greater levels of trade. And we can also be talking about sort of social movement, right? The movement of people as a part of globalization as well, and sort of communication and travel and those types of things. So we can pick our definitions, probably focus in a little bit more on the economic side of globalization for this conversation. But yeah, I mean, absolutely, I think that one of the challenges that we face is that there are winners and losers when it comes to opening up to trade. when you open up to trade, your overall production system becomes more efficient, which is that competitiveness piece that we were talking about. But parts of your, there's a restructuring that goes on in an economy when you do that. Your local workers, especially if you're a developed country and you open yourself up to greater trade with developing countries, then the workers in your society that will face greater competition are those that they're competing with in developing countries, right? So those are workers on the lower skill level side of the spectrum. And this is the piece that I think is a really important thing to understand, is that type of competition where our lower skilled workers are feeling some of the pressures and the opportunities that are generated tend to be for higher skilled workers in the United States, is the same type of thing that's happening because of another huge trend that's underway at the same time, which is technological advance. And so as we have automation on the factory floor, the jobs that become redundant, the jobs that cease to exist are the ones that can be automated, the things that are repetitive tasks that you can have a machine do that tend to be the work that was done previously by lower skilled workers in the United States. And so if we look at sort of like manufacturing job losses in the United States, the vast majority of them have been because of automation. They've been because of productivity-enhancing technological and change. A study out of Ball State University recently found that 85% of manufacturing job losses over the last 15 years or so have been the result of automation and similar types of processes on the factory floor. That leaves, though, that other 15% that are sort of trade or globalization related. And basically what it is, there are, and this is what basic trade theory tells us, we just didn't pay enough attention to it, is that when you open up, your economy, you face greater competition, but you also have efficiency gains. The wins are bigger than the losses. There are more winners than there are losers. There are more gains than there are losses, but there are losses, right? That means those are real losses. These are real people. These are real families. These are real communities. And so you have to figure out what to do with that, right? I mean, in theory, there's enough to sort of spread the wins to those who are losing, and everybody can be better off as a result. But we never did that. And that doesn't have to mean just sort of handouts or something like payouts to people that lost their jobs. It can mean worker training. It can mean educational opportunities. It can mean a lot of different things, whatever society decides. But we, as a country, I think, did very little on that side and just trusted that, essentially we trusted that workers that lost their jobs because there was an industry that was facing import competition would be able to move easily to another industry where they were where they were winners. And it turns out that that's harder to do than everyone thought, than economists thought, than everyone thought. If the job opportunities that are being created are in Seattle and the job losses are in Ohio, well, then you've got to be willing to uproot your family and move them across the country to find that job opportunity. If the job losses are in sort of line work on a manufacturing plant and the job opportunities are in, legal services, well, there's a big gap in terms of skills that you need to cross before you can engage in those types of opportunities. And that's the part of it that we haven't done, been successful at, in my opinion. And I think that right now, a lot of the skepticism that we see regarding trade and globalization, that's us paying the price for not having been successful in addressing those things that we should have known were coming.
I want to step back from this just for a second and talk about the border. When I lived and worked in San Diego and I worked on this cross-border economic development initiative, it was a great experience, and I used to tell people every day, wow, what a great job. I grew up in Kansas and I get to go to another country every day for work. And it was interesting. I learned a lot about the history of manufacturing in Mexico. And the reason I bring this up is because so much of the debate today, again, is about, okay, we lost our jobs because of manufacturing in Mexico. But it was interesting for me to understand the whole history of the maquiladoras, the Mexican manufacturing that grew up within this special economic zone along the border, and that it, in fact, predated NAFTA. NAFTA just kind of made it work better. But Mexico had already started figuring this out, the ability to do some manufacturing for multinational companies along the border. And when the Cold War was over, the great big peace dividend that everybody was looking for, we won't be spending money on military anymore, we'll be able to invest in our economies. Well, one of the downsides, or not the downsides, but the unintended consequences, that China came on board. And that's the piece that people often forget, is that with the end of the Cold War, all of the other countries that came into the global economy, and that was a good thing. I mean, if you go back and you think back to the political rhetoric of the Cold War, that was what we were after, was to have global peace and everybody kind of work together and interact with one another.
And I think that's one of the pieces of the NAFTA legacy, and I didn't talk about it when I spoke about NAFTA at the beginning, that is sort of forgotten at this point, is that NAFTA was actually, I mean, if you look back at what some of the top economic advisors were telling both President Bush and then President Clinton, because the Bush administration, the first Bush administration, negotiated NAFTA, and then the Clinton administration, right when they took office, had to pass NAFTA through the Congress. And so they were both involved in the decision as to whether or not we should go forward with it. And the Council of Economic Advisors in both of those White Houses, really said to the president, the economic benefits for the United States, an economy that's more than 10 times at the time larger than the Mexican economy, will be minor. There will be some economic benefits, but they'll be minor. What this really is a foreign policy agreement. It's an agreement that can change the nature of the U.S. Mexico relationship. And that was exactly what we tried to do with trade over time. Historically during the Cold War, was we tried to build a system that would bring countries together, because countries that trade and that have agreements to trade together, have a cooperative framework for the relationship and are unlikely to go to war with one another, et cetera. And so in the case of Mexico, I think a lot of people forget that, before that period, before, the 1980s and earlier, there was a huge amount of tension in the U.S.-Mexico relationship. It was sort of managed tension. There was sort of an implicit agreement that Mexico could kind of do what they wanted to do and say what they wanted to say, as long as they didn't go so far to actually sort of invite the Soviets into Mexico. But it was not a positive relationship. And so in the 1980s, on drug issues, we remember the case of like Kiki Camarena, a DE agent who was kidnapped in Mexico by drug cartels, by drug trafficking organizations, tortured and killed. It led to an awful blowout between the United States and Mexico. The United States actually went in and just kidnapped. There's not really another, it was extrajudicial kidnapping of some of the people that we suspected were involved in the killing and brought them to the United States. I bring that up because that shows you what the relationship was like before NAFTA, before we, the United States and Mexico, undertook an intentional effort to improve the relationship and to come together as two countries. And then if you look at what's developed, not just on economic terms, but also in terms of security cooperation, since then, we live in a totally different world. I mean, the world that we live in now is one in which flights into Mexico from any country around the world, that passenger manifest data, the list of passengers on those flights, gets sent to the United States to be run through terrorist watch databases so that we can ensure that there's never a terrorist attack on the United States that involves a crossing from Mexico into the United States. In 2015, Mexico actually detained and deported more Central American migrants than the United States did, in order to help the United States try to deal with this increasing flow of perhaps you could consider them refugees, but people fleeing violence and poverty in Central America. And Mexico has done quite a bit to sort of maintain this close relationship with the United States. One that we changed the dynamic on sort of drugs. The traditional dynamic was that Mexico would blame, the United States would blame Mexico for sending all its drugs to the United States, right? For allowing the production to take place, for allowing the type of corruption to take place that allowed drugs trafficking to take place. And Mexico would turn around and blame the United States for its insatiable demand for drugs and for sending weapons into Mexico to arm the drug cartels, the drug trafficking organizations in Mexico. It was a cycle of mutual recrimination. Well, that's actually been broken. Now what they have adopted is an idea of shared responsibility, in which we both say this is a regional problem. There are causes on both sides of the border, and we need to work together across the border to deal with it. That's just not possible without this framework of cooperation that NAFTA was a part of, a movement in changing the nature of U.S.-Mexico relations. And so in the sense of sort of trade agreement being successful in changing the overall tone of a relationship and what's possible in terms of cooperation between two countries, NAFTA was very successful in that regard.
So kind of looking at Mexico for a little bit deeper dive here, you mentioned how Mexico has changed and the nature of the relationship. I mean, for many years, Mexico had a one-party system for all practical purposes. How has their political changes in the last 20 plus years, how has that helped aid not just NAFTA, but kind of change the relationship between the U.S. and Mexico?
Yeah, I mean, so in 2000 was the first time that Mexico had an opposition party become president. Before that, for around 70 so years, there was a single party system in Mexico. It's what Mario Vargas Llosa, the Peruvian author, called the perfect dictatorship, because it had all the trappings of democracy, but none of the substance of democracy. And you could really have a system in which they called it the dedazo, which is like the finger, the former president taps the next president, who taps the next president, who taps the next president. And that was the system of governance. And within that, I mean, I think that the two things happen together, which is what's interesting, is that, NAFTA was begun to be negotiated while Mexico was undergoing, first a process of economic opening. And the interesting thing there is that, I mean, I think the strategy from the ruling party in Mexico was actually, they realized there was a huge problem once you had, basically, the 1970s, they found a bunch of oil. They over-leveraged the country. Oil prices crashed a couple of different times. Mexico went into tremendous debt and had major economic crises. You go into the 1980s, known as the lost decade throughout Latin America. The country's facing a lot of pressure, both in terms of economic pressure and in terms of pressure for political opening and for democracy. And the bet by the ruling party was really, let's open up economically so that we can create more economic opportunity for people, so that we don't have to open up politically, so that we can maintain power. Well, they did. They started to go through that process of economic opening and liberalization, but it wasn't successful in stemming, the pressures for democracy that were sort of, gathering force in Mexico. And so, I mean, what's interesting to me is that you have this change in the nature of the U.S. Mexico relationship through NAFTA happening at the same time that you have democracy, forming in Mexico. So it wasn't until, just before the 1994 elections that you had the precursor of the IFE, the Electoral Institute, really create a system for fair elections in Mexico. 1997, when opposition party first takes over Congress, and then 2000, when they win the presidency. That's the same period in which U.S.-Mexico relations are improving. I mean, is that by chance? No, I don't think so. And I don't mean that the United States was the cause of democracy in Mexico. I mean that Mexicans pushing for democracy changed the space for what, for having the ability to have a more positive relationship with the United States. And in fact, the limitations on democracy in Mexico, the persistent corruption that does still exist, is one of the reasons why Mexico can so easily become a punching bag in the United States, like we saw happen during this last election cycle. I mean, if Mexico had made a complete transition to democracy, it would be much harder for the United States to sort of, for political actors in the United States to use Mexico as a political punching bag. It's when there are human rights abuses going on, those types of things. I mean, that makes it very easy to set a country up as an enemy, as a problem, as a challenge for the United States. And so, on the one hand, the process of democratization, the amount of democratization that's taken place, creating a competitive multi-party democracy in Mexico has made, opened up a tremendous space for more positive relationships between our countries, and the limitations on that democracy remain one of the limitations on the ability to have an even more positive relationship between our two countries.
So, NAFTA and the political democratization in Mexico kind of went hand in hand. Do you think one could have happened without the other?
I don't think that there could have been. I think that democratization was primarily driven by domestic factors. The U.S. and through NAFTA, I think we played sort of a minor supporting role in that process that was unfolding, but it was driven by the aspirations of Mexicans to have a better life for themselves and for their families, in my opinion. But yeah, in my mind, that opened up the space for much improved relations with the United States. And so I don't think that you could have had that improvement in relations between our two countries without having that process of democratization underway in Mexico.
I want to talk just a second about manufacturing. I mean, again, because obviously for Kansas, exporting ag is the big export, but there is quite a bit of manufacturing that's exported to Mexico. And you talked about these supply chains, as well as the idea that there's a lot of intermittent manufacturing and movement of goods. And you kind of touched on that. What does that mean? I mean, this is, like I say, this is a complicated topic, and it can kind of get kind of heavy at times and go, whoa, it's not real interesting, but yet it's important. So can you kind of explain about how some of this manufacturing isn't just done in one place, but how things kind of move around and are put together?
Yeah, so half of all U.S. Mexico trade is trade in inputs. So the things that,
means?
The parts or materials that are used for production. So if I run a factory, whatever I buy, as my materials that I need to make the product that I'm making, those are inputs. So half of what's moving across the U.S.-Mexico border in either direction, over $100 billion, over Mexico and Mexican factories use over $100 billion of U.S. parts and materials every year, and U.S. factories and production systems use over $100 billion of parts and materials made in Mexico each year. And that makes up about half of our entire trading relationship. So it's a huge, sort of portion of what's going on between our two countries. And what it means, I mean, to take an example that you said, Kansas and Wichita, I think, is in particular a center of aerospace in the state. Bombardier, a Canadian company, is one of the companies that has a presence in Wichita. They also have a presence in Querétaro in Mexico, in central Mexico. Actually, it's a big success story because they recently opened up an aerospace university as Bombardier was landing, so they're creating sort of the workforce and the skills that are needed to do higher level, more sophisticated manufacturing work in the aerospace industry in Mexico. And of course, they have their headquarters and still have operations in Canada as well. So you're talking about a plane made by Bombardier. It has, includes parts and materials made in all three countries of North America that get moved throughout the continent, back and forth. Mexico still doesn't make a full plane. They don't do final assembly of an airplane yet. They haven't sort of reached that stage in their aerospace industry yet. So they'll make sort of, parts of the fuselage or something like that. And then that part of the fuselage, sort of major components, major chunks of a plane, will get shipped back to maybe Wichita, where the final assembly will take place with other parts and materials coming in from Canada. When we talk about cars made in North America, the automotive industry is one of the most integrated, continental-wide industries out there. We talk about the cars made in North America, the main components of a car having crossed a border in North America 8 times during the course of production. So you sort of imagine, the little, screw or widget being made somewhere. Actually, you could think about the steel coming from Mexico, maybe the steel being made in Mexico, it getting stamped into some of the small parts in the United States somewhere, getting sent back to Mexico to be put into the engine block or whatever. These are the movements that are going on back and forth. And I guess the important consequences of that, there are a few, are that, one, the business cycles of the United States and Mexico are now linked together. So since NAFTA, really, we experience cycles of growth and recession together. The most, the poignant example of that is that when the United States had the Great Recession, when we entered the crisis in 2008, 2009, the Mexican economy in 2009 also went into recession, not because it had a problem with its housing market, a debt issue, sort of any sort of structural financial issue, just because it's so tightly linked to the United States economy. And the GDP of Mexico actually fell more than the GDP of the United States. They entered a deeper recession than the US did, just because of how linked together our economies are at this point. So that also works on the positive side, we grow together. But more than just sort of short-term business cycles, it's also longer-term competitiveness. It means that when Mexico undertakes a series of structural reforms in its economy, like they did in 2012, 2013, one of the big reforms was in the telecom sector. So now, after they sort of opened up the telecom sector to greater competition and imposed some rules to basically to try to get rates lower, they were successful. And phone costs are less for Mexico. Every company has a phone bill, right? No matter what type of company you are, you have a phone bill. So that makes up just a little piece of your overall costs of production. So if you're a manufacturing company, when they had a telecom reform, your cost of production just went down by a tiny bit. That means that the US companies that buy part of that $100 billion of parts and materials from Mexico go into the US, they get their product for just a little cheaper now as a result of that improvement in the Mexican economy. That makes them more competitive as a company, better able to fend off imports from another part of the world, better able to export to other parts of the world as well. So that's another one. Our competitiveness becomes linked together because we're producing things together. And then the third really important consequence, especially right now, to be thinking about in this political context, is that if we have these goods that are coming, from the United States being used in production in Mexico and then coming, going all around the world, but a lot of them are coming back to the United States. Well, then if we impose a tariff on goods coming in from Mexico, that's actually indirectly a partial tariff on the goods that are coming out from the United States, right? Because it's going to make the product in the whole process of production is going to become more expensive. And so both the US side of that process of production, as well as the Mexican side of that process of production, end up losing out as a result of those types of policies.
So let's kind of come forward to the election year. And here we are, and they've already announced that NAFTA, the papers have been submitted to start the renegotiation process of NAFTA. Not knowing what the outcome is going to be or how long it's going to take. You and I discussed a little bit, we were talking about this a little bit earlier, about just kind of what this means for the US, for Kansas, for Mexico, for the entire North American trade group. But one of the things that was particularly of interest to me, and I had asked, the Wilson Center puts on a number of conference calls. They'll have experts on, and you can dial in and listen. And so I was explaining, I asked if he had been on this call in February with Luis de la Calle, who was one of the original NAFTA negotiators. And so now Luis is a consultant and does a variety of things. And so he can be a little more candid since he's not working for the federal government, the Mexican federal government. And so his analysis was that NAFTA, that President Trump doesn't really, NAFTA wasn't a big issue for him, that it's more of a negotiating tactic for something else, that Trump is most interested in tax reform. And so he's collecting these kinds of issues like NAFTA, so that when he goes to Congress to do his final negotiation, he can kind of trade things back to get the different points that he wants. And so I was asking, what do you think about that? And is the whole issue, for example, around corn, where the Mexican government has said, we've already started looking at finding alternative countries to source our corn, because corn is such a key part of our diet, and we don't grow enough to meet our own demand. All of Kansas corn is sold in Mexico. So you can imagine kind of the ripple effect of that already. So my question is really kind of a long, kind of meandering way of, what do you think about this whole piece of how much of this is negotiating tactics, do you think, and how much of it is really sincere? Is NAFTA at threat?
I don't know that I think about it really in either of those terms. I mean, I really believe that the Trump campaign tapped into a sense of frustration that people feel in their day-to-day lives with their economic, what they feel is economic insecurity. I mean, the fact that real medium household income in the United States is still below its 1999 peak and just finally recovered from the recession, the fact that we have, manufacturing job losses that have been happening on a secular basis since the 1970s, leaving lots of families feeling like their kids might have not the same opportunities that they've had. I think that that's at the root of it. And so to me, the most important question is, what's enough for the voters? But there are two levels of games that are being played here, because when they start to actually talk about an NAFTA renegotiation, then all of the interest groups, all of the folks who have businesses or are involved in or live in border communities that benefit so much from NAFTA, they all feel like something huge is on the line. And that's where, I think the corn, actually, I saw it happen, that a lot of companies, as the Trump presidency started, were really afraid to speak up on behalf of trade, even if it was really important to their bottom line. And the reason for that was maybe there are multiple reasons, but one big part of it was they were kind of keeping their heads down. During the campaign, there were companies that got tweeted at and saw their shareholder prices drop, 8 or 10% in a couple days. They were being, those were the companies that were being said they were the ones that were outsourcing, which meant that they were taking jobs out of the United States. So they didn't want to sort of get involved in the conversation. So the manufacturing companies in particular were really, they were kind of scared. They were not sure how to navigate this new scenario. And on the other hand, they were also thinking about the fact that the Trump campaign had promised them a huge corporate tax cut. right? So on the one hand, you have the possibility of getting major tax reform that would be of huge benefit for them. On the other hand, you have the possibility of sort of upending the trade architecture that they depend on so heavily for their businesses. So they didn't know how to act, but the corn farmers did, because the corn farmers didn't have any of those complicated concerns. They just knew that 30% of their product was getting sold abroad, or 30% of their exports were going to Mexico. And they knew that if there was a trade conflict between the two countries, this is how, Mexico and other countries in general, they're smart about how the US political system works. They know that the ag industry has a heavy influence on politics. And so, for example, in 2009, 2010, when there was a conflict around the implementation of trucking, NAFTA had sort of promised that Mexican trucks would be able to make deliveries into the United States. The US didn't follow through with that and wasn't implementing that part of the agreement. Mexico took that to the WTO, actually got authorization to impose retaliatory tariffs on the US. Anyway, they get to choose where they want to put those tariffs, anywhere on the US economy. And they said, we want to pick Christmas trees from Oregon. I mean, they can't say from Oregon, but they picked the Christmas trees, the specific product out of the Christmas trees from Oregon. Why? Because Ron Wyden, who's an important person in terms of trade policy in Congress, is from there. They can pick, they go after ag industries and they go after specific ag industries. Corn farmers felt like we might be on the front end of this. If there's a conflict on trade, we could easily be the ones who feel this first. And so they started speaking up before any of the manufacturing companies were speaking up, and the American Farm Bureau started speaking up. And they really started to have, they actually began a conversation in which now you have many more companies and many more interest groups that are sort of defending NAFTA, that are saying, this is what's on the line for us if this stops, working the way that it does. There's absolutely been sort of a change in the conversation as a result of that. I'm not so sure that, from the perspective of the president, that it's a big chessboard that he's playing. I mean, I think he was responding to something that he saw out in society. And now, as a result of having promised to make major changes to NAFTA again and again and again and again, because he described it as the cause of this manufacturing job losses in the United States, well, now he has to follow through on that, right? I mean, the fundamental promise, there's a surface level promise, which is to change NAFTA, but the fundamental promise is to fight on behalf of the American worker, right? And that's the real one that he needs to deliver on. And the challenge there is that whatever you do to change NAFTA is not going to deal with that fundamental underlying issue of the challenges facing the American worker. Because if 85% of the manufacturing job losses were due to technological change, and a small portion had something to do with trade, but there's also benefits of trade, as well as the cost. Whatever you do to change NAFTA is just, it can't address that fundamental concern. So my concern looking forward is, even if, because now they're talking more about, the letter to Congress said a modernization of NAFTA.
Yep.
They used, instead of the word renegotiation, they changed it to the word modernization. It suggests that they're moving towards more minor changes, and changes that really would just, NAFTA is an agreement that was negotiated 25 years ago.
Before cell phones, before
before
the
businesses
internet,
found
yes.
their customers online,
Right.
Before any of these things, before you had to worry about where data was housed about your buyer, your seller and buyer, before any of those things existed, before biologic drugs existed. There are plenty of things that can be updated. But if we're talking about a more wholesale revision, then it starts pushing us into different territory. And so I think that this move towards modernization suggests that we're doing more minor things. But my fundamental question is, does that meet the needs of the concerns of the voter, right? Does that meet the needs of and the concerns of the person who felt frustrated and felt like they had a level of economic insecurity in the first place? And I think we have to see how that plays out still.
So let's just assume for the moment, just for the sake of this argument, that what happens with NAFTA is going to be primarily modernization, updating it to reflect the changes in the different types of e-business and technology that didn't even exist before. There will still then be negative impacts of any kind of trade, but of NAFTA. So what might be some of the ways in which policymakers, Washington, kind of mitigate these? I mean, what would be some specific kinds of things?
Sure. I mean, first, the one thing I have to say is those negative impacts of NAFTA, they already happened, right? That happened in the past, a long time ago, actually, at this point. Because you're talking about structural changes in the economy as a result of new competition. Well, it's not new competition anymore. So, and research sort of backs this up. It shows that any sort of impact on the labor market in terms of wages has long since passed. There's now, NAFTA has no negative and in fact a slight positive impact on US wages at this point.
So if a company announces like Carrier did not too long ago that, well, we'd had this in the works, we are gonna go ahead and move this manufacturing south of the border. So I mean, there still could be examples or concrete parts of the country where
yeah, it's just probably not NAFTA that caused that, because if it was NAFTA that was going to cause it, why didn't they move 20 years ago? I guess would be the sort of response to that. But you're right? I mean, globalization is still an ongoing process, and there's still companies making these types of decisions. And so we still, as a society, have this really fundamental question of how do we address it? How do we manage that? And to me, there's only one huge answer, and it's really difficult to do, but it's our fundamental challenge as society, which is that, I mean, you have to prepare your workers to take advantage of the opportunities that are created. I mean, there are a couple of different responses theoretically that you could have. One would be to not allow your economy to continue to evolve, to try to hold things in place so that you don't have these challenges of evolution and changes in your economy. You'd have to try to hold technology in place and not allow technological, I mean, those productivity enhancements are what allow us to live a better life, right? I mean, we need to remember that productivity is the most closely linked thing to GDP per capita and sort of income and all of those things. The only way to get a higher income is to improve productivity. So I don't think we want to let go of that. I don't think we want to stop advancing as a country. So that's probably not the best solution. You know, another would be to have a massive social safety net so that whoever, was on the losing side, you sort of just paid them out. You know, you have companies that are winners paying taxes, and you pay those out to the losers, and then everybody, theoretically can sort of be a winner as a result of that. I don't think personally that that's sort of the American vision. I mean, I think that there is some interesting evidence that countries that have larger social safety nets have higher levels of support for globalization in general. So maybe there's something to that type of an approach, but to me it doesn't feel like the American approach. To me, the American approach, an approach based on the idea of equality of opportunity seems to me to be to ensure that those who are, forced out of what they were doing previously, a previous type of employment, have the tools to move into new types of employment. And one of those, so part of that's sort of job retraining, but at a more fundamental level, I think it's something that happens across generations as well, which means that the most important type of training that takes place is just through a basic education system. Right? I mean, since the recession in the United States, more than 95% of jobs that have been created require some level of post-secondary education. That's just the economy that we live in these days. And it's, it's a totally different economy than we had 40, 50 years ago, where you could, with a high school degree, have a comfortable middle-class life and provide what your kids need so that they can have a good life. It's a challenge, to live in that type of world where you just need higher levels of education. And it doesn't mean four-year degrees for everybody. It means vocational training as well. But it seems to me that if we want to, facilitate, if we have an economy that's evolving quickly, you can either train your workforce for the jobs of the future, or you can let them fall behind. And I don't think that we've done enough as a country to train our workforce for the jobs of the future. And if there's one thing that and this to me is a huge point of frustration, because I think that the conversation that we're having nationally right now is avoiding that conversation, right? We're talking about the same fundamental frustration that's out there, fundamental economic insecurity that people feel. And instead of having a real serious conversation about how to prepare our country for the changes that are underway in society and in the world, we're having a conversation about trying to hold the world in place and prevent globalization from occurring. And I think that we're losing out on an opportunity to prepare ourselves for the future as a result of that.
So we're getting close to the Q&A time. I kind of ran over the last time, so I'm mindful of the time. But just in kind of broadly, since you've been working on U.S. Mexico issues, what's been the most surprising thing that you learned or that you've run into since you've been working on it?
That's an interesting one. I guess it's something that, what I think surprising is, at a very fundamental level, I think that there's a huge amount of misperception in the United States about what Mexico is, and that has very strong impact on our relations with Mexico. And so, I mean, it's, you know, I think something that, you know, when I first started visiting Mexico City, you know, sort of light bulb went off in my head. It's like, wait a second, this is not, you know, just a poor country. It's a country that has a lot of poverty, right? 50% of Mexico lives in poverty. That's significant. It's a huge challenge for the country, right? But that means that another 50% of the country is middle class or higher, right? And that, I mean, I woke up to that by spending time in Mexico, right? And then, but I think that we as a country have not fully woken up to that. And I think as a result, we're very comfortable with these narratives that have, you know, a carrier closing in the US, going to find cheap wages in Mexico. You know what? If it was just about cheap wages, a country, they would have not gone to Mexico, because Mexico has far from the cheapest wages around the world. There are plenty of countries, you know, they could have gone to Cambodia, they could have gone to Bangladesh, et cetera. But Mexico has transformed tremendously over the years. I mean, it's gone from being a country that builds, you know, makes t-shirts and shoes, to a country that makes cars and airplanes, right? And I don't think that we in the United States as a country have sort of stayed up to date with that vision of Mexico. And it's a complicated vision, because it's one of poverty and wealth living side by side. It's one of an old, you know, democracy and corruption and an embedded system of the powers that be, that, you know, they live side by side. It's a country in which you have war zone-like levels of violence in certain cities, and you have, you know, other cities like Mexico City that are much safer than Washington, D.C., where I live. So it's difficult to hold all those things side by side in your head, those contradictions, but that's Mexico, you know, and I think that if we as a country can do a better job of understanding Mexico, then we'll do a better job of understanding how to take advantage of the relationship between our two countries.
Good, good. All right, well, we're ready to take questions.
You mentioned job training. What are the alternative job training possibilities that you see, and what ones do you think might work best?
Yeah, so that's actually my next project. Because it's such a fundamentally important question, I think, that I want to try to answer that in a really serious way. And so I've started to do research on the question. And there are a few things that we can say very clearly in terms of what research shows us about what works and what doesn't work. But I have a lot more to learn still about what works and what doesn't work. One thing is that training centers or community colleges or wherever you're seeing the training taking place, they do a good job when they're working together with industry to create the programs. So if, you know, programs in which the curriculum is designed in conjunction between a training institution and private industry, those tend to work much better because they're training them for the skills that they actually need in the workforce, and you have a potential employer right there ready to hire some of your workers as they train. Another one, and it sounds like a no-brainer, but it ends up being really important, is that when retraining programs work, it's because it's when the person who is trained does a program in a certain area and then gets a job in that same area. It sounds like obvious, right? Like a training program works when you train somebody as a nurse or as a home healthcare provider, and then they get a job in nursing or home healthcare, you know. But that doesn't happen all the time, unfortunately. A lot of times people go through a training program in one thing, and they don't find a job in that, and so they end up going and working in something else that they, you know, so they don't get any of the benefits of the training they just did. And so whatever we can do to ensure that, you know, the things that we're training people for, there are locally jobs available in, or jobs being created in, those are really, you know, really key things. A third thing that I'm involved in a project in South Texas right now, an economic development project in South Texas along the U.S Mexico border there. And one of the things that we're seeing is that, and it sounds kind of contradictory to what I just said, but their training institutions are only willing to provide training for the jobs that they see there today, and they're not willing to have a comprehensive strategy to create an economy of sort of where they need to be. And so somehow at the same time, you need to ensure that people are training in something and then getting a job at that industry. But also, if you're in an area that's like deindustrialized and just has low-paying service jobs, you need to find out what your next better industry is. And you shouldn't just dream that up and make it up and try to create it. You have to actually identify assets that are there on the ground now that will allow you to evolve to that next, stage in your development. But I think another thing is that you have to, integrate worker training into broader economic development strategy. That's what I know now. There's a lot probably that I don't know about how to do it effectively.
You spoke briefly about the need to educate students that are already in the system so that we prepare for the future. I don't see a lot of movement in that in terms of the Kansas legislature. I don't know if you're that familiar with it. But what would you say to legislators who are making the decisions about funding public education as well as workforce training that would be convincing?
I mean, just what I said before. I mean, I'm not an education specialist like this, so I can't tell you or them how to do it. Like, I'm personally agnostic as to whether it's all has to be public solutions or if there are public-private partnerships that can be answers, or if they're, school choice. I'm agnostic on that stuff because I try to base my opinions on the facts that I see in the research that I do, and I don't have all the answers there. But what I do know from what I see is that we, over the last, 20-some years, 30-some years, have not done enough to prepare our workforce for the jobs of the future as our economy are evolving based on all these trends that we see happening in technology, in trade, in globalization. And I see those trends continuing, right? I mean, from the side of looking at manufacturing and globalization and things like that, things I do look at, those trends have not taken their course yet. They have not finished the process yet. I mean, I look at sort of long-term shape of the U.S. labor market, and you see, like, over 150 years, you see, like, we used to all work in agriculture, right? Now, 2% of our population, less than 2% of our population works in agriculture. Why? Because productivity enhancements in agriculture have been tremendous, right? We see service jobs going up and up and up, and those are all types of different service jobs, whether in healthcare, education, whether in finance, et cetera. But the other, trend that we see is we saw manufacturing jobs go up and up as a portion of the population, and then since the 50s, we've seen as a portion of total employment, those going down and down. That hasn't finished yet. I mean, that trend is still very much a work in progress, and I think we're going to see that automation that was driving productivity enhancements in manufacturing start to take place in a lot of service industries. So I'm, was at an IT conference a month or so ago, and they were talking about how, their like IT support for offices is being automated. They're having automated fixes to a lot of the common problems that people have with their emails, whatever, with their servers, et cetera. So I think that, this trend it's still, we're very much in a process of transition in terms of the sort of the nature of our economy, the shape of our economy. And so, I mean, I just know that if we don't train one way or another our workers for those jobs of tomorrow, the ones that require programming skills, the ones that require maintenance skills for, for robots on the manufacturing floor, et cetera, then, we're going to have this mismatch. And that's what we have right now. We have this great skills gap where we actually have, hundreds of thousands, some would say a couple of million manufacturing jobs available or being created within the next few years in this country that will go unfilled because we don't have the workers with the right skills to fill them. So, our option is, leave those opportunities untapped, those jobs unfilled, because we don't train our workers for them, or do it so that they can have good, and they're better jobs. I mean, that's the thing that's amazing about this, right? I mean, and to take it back to the U.S. Mexico side, I think there's a great study that was done a couple of years ago that shows that U.S. companies, when they outsource to Mexico, on average, it's not a carrier type situation. On average, sort of statistically speaking, individual companies, as they're growing their footprint in Mexico, they're actually simultaneously increasing employment in the United States, increasing exports from the United States, and the tightest relationship, the strongest relationship, is that they're increasing R&D spending in the United States, research and development spending. So what that tells you is, yes, they're moving part of their lower skilled operations, the labor side of their operation, to Mexico, but the jobs that are being created here are engineering jobs, management jobs, those types of things. We need to have the skills.
Christopher, I just wanted to, in part, first to thank you for bringing such a I want to say, comprehensive perspective to a lot of these issues, and not just a kind of a narrow discussion about this or that one dimension. So many economic reports, development proposals, policies, what do you want to call it, focus on very narrow aspects or slivers, and I think that contributes to the way in which these issues get demagogued, because there really isn't a fleshing out of these sorts of things. So I wanted to start with that. If this is a hypothetical, and it may, you've touched on it a little bit, but if you were under some administration, this again a hypothetical administration, and given your position and your insight into these issues, taking into account all pieces of the picture, like you said, the retraining, maybe relocation, even the international economy with banking arrangements, tax laws, offshoring, all those elements too. If you were said, okay, you're the czar for policy, and organizations like NAFTA or whatever they may be, and the question to you is, maybe we need a new organization, maybe we need something that is Western hemispheric as well as Northern, we want to include Central and South America, whatever. You get a chance to design it, you get a chance to take into account the different components, even retraining and re-education and so on and so forth, and developing the arguments for it. In terms of your wish list or your set of ideal scenarios, is there anything you haven't already touched on or that you could further elaborate on? Or I want to open a door for you to further go down this path of touching on some of the areas of concern that you've articulated.
Okay. It's a big one. It's a tough one. I don't think that, I guess I have to start by saying that the most fundamental things, for the U.S. economy are things that we need to do at home. In terms of to get the benefits of globalization, just to better spread the benefits of economic prosperity throughout the country. I think that the workforce thing that I have talked about is one of the big ones, education workforce. I think that infrastructure spending in the United States, and that just gets us into budget, right? So dealing with entitlements, these are huge, huge issues, right? That's why you have to have the czar of everything, I guess, right? So all that package of things needs to happen so that we can have the investments in infrastructure that we need. That I think is hugely important. But I don't think that the benefits of sort of trade and international cooperation are all tapped out yet. Trade policy is what I really focus a lot on. In that space, I think what's happened is we've lowered tariffs quite a bit all around the world. NAFTA brings them regionally to zero, basically. But even just with the World Trade Organization, global tariffs are very low. So there's very little more to gain by lowering tariffs further. And so what's happened as a result of that is that trade policy has started to look at non-tariff barriers to trade. And then you start to get in all these different really important types of things. Safety standards for automobiles. Well, we all want our cars to be safe, right? But Europe's version of safe, and the standards that are associated with it looks a little different than ours. Now, frankly, cars in either Europe or the United States are pretty safe, right? But the issue is that right now you still need like a different production line to produce for the European market than you do for the US market. There are a million examples of those types of things where just standards and regulations are not aligned between different nations and among nations. I think that working in that space, there's still a lot of efficiency gains that can be had. I do think really something like NAFTA is not an ideal solution. Really the best benefits to trade opening come when you do things at the multilateral level, when you do things at the global level. There was always a concern with regional trade agreements that you'd be doing trade diversion, meaning that if sort of everyone had the same playing field, the economics say that you can be most efficient by making this product in Colombia. Right? Well, that's where it ought to be made by sort of from an economic perspective and to have the most efficiency. But if we have a special North American free trade zone, it might be made in Mexico instead, right? So really, what we ought to do is try to find a way to advance things at the WTO. The thing is that things at the WTO got stuck about 15 years ago, and they haven't moved forward with much of anything since. And so what we've seen instead as the path forward has been these coalitions of the willing, these smaller groups of countries coming together, whether doing what they call plurilaterals at the WTO, like on information technology, trade and services agreement there, or doing things like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is a group of like 12 nations just around the Pacific. So we're looking at these bigger regional blocks. I mean, yeah, ideally we'd go back to being able to move these issues forward at a global level so that we can improve the efficiency of the entire global economy. And then I think just in a very big sense, we need to be honest about the challenges associated with the process of globalization, not just in the United States, but around the world, right? Because they look a little bit different if we ask these same questions about the Mexican economy, or if we ask them about another economy, because they're in a different stage of development, so the way that the issues play out works a little bit differently. So each country would need to address those things, mostly by themselves, right? I mean, mostly the responses are actually through domestic policy. So you create the global policy, global economic policy to create the maximum efficiency possible, and then within each country, you need to create mechanisms to deal with the adjustments, to deal with the transitions that are inherent in that type of an opening.
I'd like to ask your candid opinions on another skills gap, the political skills gap. Apropos, given that we're in the Dole Institute of Politics, to say that our current crop of political leaders have a comic book understanding of both international trade, economics, and immigration is an insult to readers of comic books. NAFTA was negotiated by First President Bush, and he probably lost the election because of his embrace of NAFTA and because of the seizure of the issue in a xenophobic, ignorant way by Ross Perot, in spite of winning the presidency indirectly. Because of NAFTA, President Clinton embraced it. We have a current crop of Republican leaders who have embraced xenophobia and fear of immigrants as a winning way to win elections, both at the municipal, state, and national level. We have Democrats who are still afraid to embrace trade because of the legacy of their attachment to organized labor and all of that. We seem to have a perfect storm now to reverse the gains of the last several decades, mostly because of our political system and politicians who play on people's ignorance and fears. Who amongst the current leaders in Washington stand out as someone who we can look to lead us out of this dreadful situation?
Wow, it's a tough one. All right, I work for a nonpartisan institution, so I have to be very careful in my answer to that.
Don't need to name partisan affiliation.
Yeah.
I'd like you to name some names.
Yeah, I mean, I work on U.S. Mexico relations. I can tell you that there are a few people that stand out in that arena from both sides of the aisle, for sure. I think that Senator Flake from Arizona has been a really interesting, important voice on these issues recently. I think that Senator Cornyn from Texas, someone who didn't necessarily begin his career as an ardent supporter of the U.S. Mexico relationship, has really come to be one. He's the second, leading. He's the majority whip in the Senate, so he's the second in terms of leadership in the Senate. I guess taking a step back, we talked about this a little bit earlier. I mean, I have a little bit of a hard time with this, like a leadership argument, a lack of leadership argument. I mean, I think that, I agree with you that politicians are playing on people's fears, whether it comes to trade or migration to the United States. I mean, I do think that what we saw happen in this last election was we saw people's fears about globalization, sort of in its various aspects, rise to the surface. And I would say that we saw Mexico becoming the scapegoat of those fears in this last election. So it is concerning to me. But I also, I guess when I look to try to understand what's going on, I try to look beyond just the leadership, because I do think that for the most part, political leaders respond to incentives. Now, they get to play a small role as opinion leaders, but I think they play a larger role as responding to the incentives and opportunities that are out there based on the population. And so when I look at the underlying trends of sort of, on the United States at a popular opinion level, on trade, on globalization in general, on attitudes towards migrants, on a couple of other related topics, attitudes towards Mexico, I don't see a challenge at a national level. At a national level, those things are either stable or have been improving. It's only when you see, what we see that's happened is that we become much more fragmented as a country, and we've seen bigger divides opening up within, and I think that's where we see, an opening up for opportunities there for sort of leaders to take some advantage of fears that people have. But I guess my hope comes from the fact that one of the divides that's opened up is, and no offense to any of the older people in the room, is a youth versus elderly people divide. And young people tend to be much more comfortable with globalization and all of its different aspects than older people in this country. And so I think that over time, just sort of demographics will win out, and they will force leaders to have different views than they do today on these issues. So I actually, I think there's some fear that some of the gains, could be that we've created. This system that we're talking about is not just sort of in U.S. Mexico terms. We're talking about NAFTA, which stretches 20 years back, but we're really talking about the post-World War II world order. This is a system that goes back decades in the making. I do think that there's some possibility of losing some of those gains along the way. But I guess I'm not totally worried about the future of our country. I actually, and being somebody who works in Washington, I see a lot of politicians of all different levels of capacity, very high to very low. And so I don't know if that gives you hope, but it gives me a little bit of hope personally to see that there are a lot of people out there trying to do a good job and trying to really represent their constituents.
Let me just build on that comment. And there are those who say we get the government we deserve. And so the flip side of that is this kind of ignorance reflects the sort of ignorance of the electorate, right? And our inability to tell our elected officials what we really think they ought to do. The period for public comment on the renegotiation of NAFTA opened on May 18th. So we have 90 days now to try to influence the process. And I wonder what your advice would be about how to do that. And I think it takes place at two levels. One is the corporate level, and I know that that's certainly where the major strides will be made. But you're also talking to a room full of voters who have phones and emails, I think, by and large. Yeah. What's the way to be effective in trying to shape this conversation as it moves forward? Because it's obviously going to move.
Yeah, there are actually lots of avenues for participation. The Department of Commerce opened up their official comment period, which goes through, I think, June 12th. So anyone at all can submit a comment to them. It can be 2 lines long. It can be, 20 pages long about NAFTA and what we should be trying to accomplish with this modernization process that's underway. And one thing we've seen, for sure, trade policy constitutionally is the domain of Congress, right? They're the ones who are given authority over international trade. They delegate that authority to the executive through Trade Promotion Authority, or fast track, because it's difficult for 500 some people to sit down and negotiate a trade agreement with another country. But that means still they end up, as they write those laws to delegate that authority, they ensure that they keep a lot of consultation mechanisms in place and get to play a role in formulating the objectives and monitoring the progress of negotiations. Congress right now has an incredible amount of power in terms of where we go on an NAFTA renegotiation. And, it's the easiest thing in the world to call your member of Congress and tell them what you think. I think that those, that's the most obvious way to become involved. And it works. Like, it absolutely makes a difference. I talk to and work with staffers all the time, and not only they tally those things, they remember what they hear, they talk about what they hear on those phone calls and in those letters. And then, yeah, there are also these official sort of vehicles through which the public can offer comments. And those things matter too. I mean, I guess it must feel, not like seeing how that stuff actually gets processed on the inside. It must feel ridiculous to like submit a comment through this federal registry notice, and it must feel like you're doing, just putting that into a black hole somewhere. But I guarantee you, the thing is there aren't that many people that write that stuff. And it's mostly the companies, right? Just as you say, it's mostly the companies that take the time to do that because they have so much on the line. But there aren't that many, and so everyone counts quite a bit, actually.
Can I say something to the kind of the original part of your comment and kind of just the general kind of comments? And it speaks to why I wanted to do this, and I said at the beginning that I having grown up in the Midwest and then lived and worked in DC and lived and worked in Paris and then lived and worked along the U.S. Mexico border, I understood quickly that no matter where I lived, I would be from Kansas, but I also had an opportunity to experience firsthand a lot of other issues, like the U.S. Mexico border, and I saw quickly this gap between what people, what the reality was working along the border, and you who study it and work on it all the time. So I long believe that you don't have to have a PhD, hold all of your ears, those of us who do, to be knowledgeable about something. But then that means in this complex world, with all these competing information sources, how do we educate people who don't live on the border, for example, who don't export, who aren't a manufacturer, it's not just they don't sell their corn, but they don't understand where their corn's going necessarily, although I suspect today everybody who sells corn does. So how do you break down that gap of information? And when I reached out to Chris in the first place to come and talk, I said, I want to do this to help begin to break down this gap. But it's also not just coming to universities, and I said it's also going to doing outreach with groups that don't normally embrace these ideas. You can't be afraid to talk to other groups of people, and so I think that's incredibly important, is finding other avenues to reach out to do outreach to help educate people on these topics.
Okay.
I just, a couple years ago, semi-retired from being a lawyer for 35 years in Brownsville, Texas. So
Yeah.
I've seen a lot of interesting, and lived on the border. And just, if you wouldn't mind talking to us for a moment about some sane immigration reforms, is there anything that a majority of the Americans could get behind? One thing that I've always thought is that if we had a guest worker program that worked, my experience is Mexicans don't want to be Americans. They don't want to come here to necessarily live and work. They do what is for their best interest economically, but oftentimes the journey is so dangerous, who wants to go back and do it again? So it seems to me like you might have some thoughts on some sane changes to our immigration policies that would, if 50% of Mexico is impoverished, the United States would have a lot to gain by that segment of the population coming out of poverty in terms of our own economic interests. And I'm just curious what your thoughts are on some immigration reform changes that might be possible and people might agree on.
Okay. So one of the fascinating things about U.S. Mexico migration is that we're actually at the end of the wave. So there are more non-Mexicans apprehended along the U.S. Mexico border now than Mexicans. When were you in Brownsville?
From 1981 to 2015.
Okay, so 2015, by then you were already seeing the wave of Central American migrants starting to more than half. now nationally, and way more than half in Brownsville and in the South Texas area. And so why is that, right? I mean, that's an important question to ask, is why have we seen the numbers of Mexican unauthorized migrants go down so low? In fact, studies now suggest that we're having net zero migration or net negative migration from Mexico at this point. So there are more, just barely, but more people returning to Mexico from the United States than coming from Mexico to the United States. The biggest reason for that, I mean, the Mexican economy is a little bit better. The U.S. economy got worse for a while during the recession, but it's recovered since then. Our border enforcement is up some. That's part of the story. But the biggest part of the story is demographics in Mexico. There are just fewer young people entering the labor force each year, right? That wave of population, growth in Mexico has slowed. And so as a result, there's just less pressure on the Mexican economy than there was previously. There's more capacity to absorb new people into the labor force. And so, I mean, one of the amazing things is that we're still having a conversation that's, several years behind where reality is. And I think that the positive thing about that is it suggests that 5 more years out, maybe we will start to have a different conversation about U.S. Mexico migration. On guest worker program, I believe there's space for something there. And in fact, there's a really good report that came out of the Center for Global Development recently that tried to work through some of the previous obstacles to a guest worker program and sort of work out one that might function well. One of the challenges there is how do you decide what number to cap visas at? And their suggestion, and this is one that's been sort of put out there over time, is that you need to have some mechanism for it to change with the economy, right, with the demand for labor. That's not an easy thing to do, but it's possible. So I do think that's one thing. But I also have to say there's a challenge there, which is that back when most migrants from Mexico were picking crops in the United States, it made a ton of sense to have a guest worker program because it was seasonal work, right? So you come for part of the year, you pick, the season's over, and you go home. That's not the kind of work that most people do anymore. So if they work in, construction might be somewhat seasonal, but you're talking about like restaurant jobs, hotel jobs, other service industry jobs. Those are a little more permanent. And so it's going to be harder to have a guest worker program that really solves the problem. It can only be one part of a bigger solution in my mind. As somebody who works on the border, I do have to say it's definitely my belief that one of the best policies that we could put in place to make the border more secure would be having a legal migration system that works better to meet the demands. Because the less people that you have, the more people that you have using the legal system, the less people you have using the illegal system, and the less people you have using the illegal system, the better you are able to identify the really dangerous ones using the illegal system. Because it's not so much, in my mind, the biggest concern isn't the economic migrant so much as the drug trafficker or the potential terrorist. There's never been a terrorist attack involving a crossing from Mexico to the US, but if there ever were, that would be devastating, and so we need to prevent it from ever happening. Unfortunately, I think all these things are really challenging. I mean, the areas where I see the most sort of space for movement would be like high-skilled migration reform. So, people who have, come to the US as students, get an engineering degree, and right now aren't allowed to stay in the United States because there's such a limited number of work visas available for them too, even though they'd be contributing enormously to the US economy. That's the kind of area where I see more space for political agreement across the aisle. One of the things that's historically happened there has been that Democrats, who traditionally support comprehensive immigration reform, don't want to give piecemeal because they feel like what they'll get is more border security, high-skilled immigration reform, maybe or maybe not a guest worker program, and they won't get a path to citizenship or a permanent solution for those that are here in an undocumented fashion. And so they hold out on doing piecemeal in order to get it all, but they can't get it all because there's not a consensus to get it all, right? So there's been this stalemate on migration, and so increasingly, people across the aisle are willing to consider these piecemeal approaches, meaning doing high-skilled, doing border security separately, doing each of these things separately, hoping that in the long run that changes the overall nature of the debate. I don't know whether or not it'll work, but that is, I think, slowly the direction that we're moving in.
Are the demographics of Central America different than Mexico, such that other Mexicans are a greater percentage out of the border?
Are you saying is there more Central American migration?
No, I mean, you've seen, and you just explained how there's maybe even a slight negative net migration from Mexico,
Right.
but in Central America, it's the other way.
Right.
It's it's got to be something like security or
Oh, yeah,
violence
right.
as
Why is
opposed
that?
to demographics, right?
Yeah, security is,
Right.
I mean, security is the one that's changed so much recently. It's a combination, I mean, when they do surveys and ask people why they're coming, it's a combination of three big factors: security, economic opportunity, and family reunification, right? So remember that in the 1980s, there were huge waves of Central American migration to the US when there were civil wars happening throughout Central America. And so there's a lot of people that have family members here. So family reunification is a big piece of it too. But yeah, what's changed in recent years to cause that wave has been the security situation. And part of that, ironically, was that as Mexico started to experience more drug-related violence, they put more pressure on criminal organizations in Mexico. Some of those criminal organizations started moving part of their operations to Central America to avoid, it's a balloon effect, right? I mean, this is what, previously all the cocaine came to the US through South Florida, the Caribbean route. We squeezed down on that, it popped up in Mexico. There's more pressure in Mexico, some of the criminal organizations move operations to Central America. Central American countries have much less capacity than Mexico to respond to that type of a challenge, and so the levels of violence between sort of just local gang activity and the connection to broader organized crime and drug trafficking organizations has created immense pressure in Central America, and that's led to this wave of out-migration from Central America. But we should keep in mind that even with that increase of Central American migration, overall, we're at near 40-year lows in terms of the number of apprehensions along the U.S. Mexico border right now. So even taking into account this surge in Central American migration, still in historic terms, there's very little unauthorized migration. Now, very little still means around 400,000 apprehensions per year, so that's still a lot of people that are getting caught trying to enter the country in unauthorized fashion. But it's, compared to the 1.5 million that it was a decade ago, we're in a different world.
So I'm getting a signal. Do we have time for one more? One more question.
So in renegotiating or like modernizing NAFTA, is there anyone putting any consideration into what the effects or the projected effects of climate change will be? Will Kansas-Mexico trade benefit? Because some people will say you can plant more things if the climate's warmer. Or just basically, are they even saying anything on that topic at all?
Honestly, I don't think that it's a topic that's been very explored a whole lot. I don't know a ton about it. I do know that Mexico is one of the countries that's expected to be sort of harder hit as a result of climate change in terms of the impacts on communities in Mexico. It's susceptible to hurricanes and things like that. So flooding and landslides and all that, and the impact on agricultural lands as a result of those types of impacts is significant in Mexico. It's funny you mention it because it's actually, I'm a member of the Transportation Research Board, which is an organization that sort of organizes and coordinates research to help facilitate policymaker understanding on trade issues. And that area is one of the areas that we've identified as an area that needs future study in general, as sort of linkages between climate and trade and transportation issues, or the nexus of all three of those issues. But it's not one that I know of a ton of research on currently.
Well, I'd like to thank you for making your way to the Midwest.
Thank you.
And I
Appreciate
think
it.
everybody enjoyed your discussion today. So thank you all for coming. And I encourage you all to come. Our next one isn't until June 21st, and the speaker will be Andy Carey, who is a person who will be coming from the border. He's executive director of the U.S. Mexico Border Philanthropy Partnership, and he works on both sides of the border with a number of interesting programs. So thank you all.
Thanks.